So I'm not talking about slave owners. I'm talking about fellas that own slave ships, that captain slave ships. I don't have time to get into that too deeply, but remember I mentioned the Moss family. So Thomas, James, they were brothers. James's son, little brother or son, but they were all immediate family members. Now, this Moss family is one of the most prominent and wealthy families in Liverpool, and the vast majority of these slave ships were based in Liverpool. Slavery turned Liverpool from a little small fishing village into the richest city in Britain. If it ain't the richest, it's the second richest. Okay, so I don't think people really fathom that. And when you realize that Liverpool is one of the economic hubs of not just England, UK, the British-speaking world, and how slavery is intertwined in that, and how Bahamian slavery is even intertwined into that, that's when we really have to start asking these questions about emancipation. You understand? Because remember, the slave master was compensated. Even these people from the Saltwater Underground Railroad, the ROSA, they were compensated. Even in the case of the Creole in 1855, these people were compensated. You understand what I'm saying? So these are all things that we really have to acknowledge and stop running away from. Now, the ship that they owned, one of these ships was called the Speedwell, and the Speedwell landed here in 1790. For anyone who want to check me on that. And this was owned by Henry Helen Moss. And this money was used into the founding, into the establishment of businesses like Moss & Co. that's still standing there today in England. The railroad that they have going from Liverpool to Manchester was built by John Moss. John Moss, after the death of Henry and Helen Moss, after the death of the one in Guyana and Henry Moss, he is the one who inherited many of these slaves, and that money and the compensation that he received at emancipation went into building the capital for this, okay? And then in 1790 and in 1791, on a ship ironically called the Governor Dalswell, they brought in even more slaves, and roughly it was about 250, between 180 and 250 slaves, somewhere around there, that this Moss family had brought in. So another slave trading Bahamian, if you will, is a very famous loyalist, one that is always, and remember that Moss family is the same Moss family that where the incident with Strong Blockade happened, the incident with Ben Moss, the old guy who worked all his life to free himself, only to be whipped pretty much to death in the most petty of ways. You know, they found the smallest infraction, and they was just angry that this man was able to save up money somehow and buy his freedom, whip the man to death. You understand? Now, Charles Dames is a famous loyalist, okay? And Charles Dames is the one who a lot of people, like I say, like to lotion the loyalists, right? And he was one of those, you would find him in so many history books, you know, in the little scant little dealings of the slave dealing is always there. So not only was he a very prolific slave owner, a very prolific producer of salt, you know, his plantations were, you know, literally hell on earth, he also physically brought slaves into the Bahamas, all right? So we had a ship called the Sally. And the Sally was a common ship that was always going back and forth, always doing business, always trading in salt. You understand? And this man was absolutely brutal as well, okay? I don't want people to think that this wasn't just like you would see in a movie with the slave ship, right? Now, he owned a ship called Sally that made 2 trips in 1785 and in 1786. In both these cases, he bought 80 slaves and 58 slaves from Kingston, Jamaica, and brought them here, right? So you have the case with Thomas Moss, who brought them from Africa, and then you have the case with Charles Dames, who physically brought them here, okay? Now remember, it's the same Charles Dames who used to own Florida, and Sheila Dames, who tried to work mom so hard that she had a miscarriage, and then sent her to jail in the workhouse to do hard labor just because she didn't work and do the thing, even though she's pregnant and she ain't meeting her quota. All right. Now we had another slave ship called the Live Oak. Okay, and this one came a little later in 1786. And now this ship brought 50 slaves. Now, it doesn't seem like 50 slaves is a lot. However, this ship only had 15 tonnage. 15 tonnage. So imagine that's almost like cramming 50 people on a big scarab, in the hull of a big scarab. You understand? And that slave ship came from Georgia. This is separate and apart from the slaves that he already owned and came and brought when he got his exorbitant land grants in places like Little Exuma. You understand? Places like Big Exuma, places like Long Island, and even places in New Providence. You understand? These men were not good men. These men were not made to be praised in any way, shape, or form. You understand what I'm saying? We could acknowledge things that they did. Oh, John Wells built this nice newspaper, okay, but he also owned slaves. So when do we put the suffering and the death of our ancestors? When does that take precedence? Instead of trivial things like newspapers. And you understand? Now, last but certainly not least, and I think this one might surprise a few people, but the Rogers family. Yes, talking about Woodes Rogers, his son, William Whetstone Rogers. Woodes Rogers was a prolific slave trader. As a matter of fact, his moniker, expel pirates, restore commerce. Remember that? When he said expel pirates, restore commerce, what he really meant was make the pirates work for us, and restore commerce meant turn the Bahamas into a slave colony, which is exactly what it became. Now, he was involved in several slave voyages, and he and his family is from Bristol, and they were involved in the early slave trade, and he learned his seafaring through the Bristol slave trade. So that's number one. Number two, he took part in the transatlantic slave trade even before he became the governor of the Bahamas, and he did so while he was the governor of the Bahamas. And in 1730, he had a ship called the Nassau, and that brought in hundreds of slaves that came in here, 150 or so slaves that came in here from quote-unquote present-day Gold Coast. Ironically, the same region where our hero, John Canoe, was fighting out of. Okay, so we got to ask ourselves these things. So when we talk about the quote-unquote days of piracy that they talk about were so bad, blacks in this space had a lot more autonomy. As a matter of fact, Milo Butler was not our first black head of state. A man by the name of Red Elding was our first head of state, and that happened in the 1690s during our so-called days of piracy. And as we move closer to being a baby, as my brother liked to say, a baby colonial state, as we move closer to being a baby colonial state, that's when you see the racism, the vice grip of white supremacy get tighter and tighter and tighter, not only in our physical lives, but in our psyche. You understand what I'm saying? So it's important to know how we contributed to this wealth, as I touched on earlier as well, right? So I'm going to give a few more examples as I close, right? And I promise it's the last section here, right? So we have to realize that a lot of these same families, as I mentioned, who have always been in control of the slave master, many of them left afterwards, after slavery. Just as many whites left the Bahamas after majority rule, just as many whites left the Bahamas after independence, just as many whites left Coral Harbor as blacks started to move in, just as many whites left White Grove, that used to be a coconut plantation owned by the Adderley family, White Grove, much as many of the white people left White Grove, and now mostly black people live there. So this white flight racism thing is real in the Bahamas, and there's almost no aspect of racism that you would see in your, stereotypical American Southern racism that you would not have found here. So when we look at the roads, they like to call road an absentee owner. The road slaves had a lot of free time and all this, and people don't really realize that just the fact of you owning slaves, in its sense, was wealth in itself. You understand? As a matter of fact, the Pompey Revolt happened because he was trying to move to Kid Island so that he could rent them out to Carolyn Thurston, right there by Strawnsill and Thurstonsill in North Kid Island. He wanted to rent them out to the Thurston family so that he could get the money from their labor, all right? And now the roads, all the way back to Dennis Road, these men built mansions in England. and a canal called the Royal Canal that was very significant in irrigation right through the 19th century for that. And this was built off of the slave labor, off of the sale, off of the kidnapping of our ancestors. And me, myself, I'm descended from the royal family. That none of these countries, United States, England, France, Germany, even the ones that we love to praise, Sweden, Denmark, them too, Holland, all of these ones, all of them would be nothing without the absolute degradation and oppression and the theft of African people, way of life, and minerals, and the way that we built these things. When they say the loyalists build this and the loyalists build that, the loyalists ain't build nothing. They sit down on the porch drinking lemonade while we did the work. That's what happened. You understand? And we have to take this attitude. And not only did we build the Western Hemisphere for these people for free, not only that, but they were then compensated for our emancipation. And how did the British government pay for this? But we always do this mental gymnastics to give praises where it's not due. You see it with Witch Rogers. We had a statue of Witch Rogers that's actually facing inland, which is a huge insult. The statue facing inland. I don't know who's responsible for that, but the only people that are supposed to be facing inland are sons and daughters of the soil of where that statue is. All right, so let me close this out. Yeah, Rothschild's family were the ones that gave the British government, Queen Victoria at the time, the loan that was required to compensate every slave master. Bahamianology has a document on it as well, but I don't think they have all of the records. But if you were to review, it's another thing you would Google, if you were to review the compensation records for Bahamian slave owners, it's literally the who is who of Bahamian families. Like you will see all your who's who of Bahamian families are in there. Now, this loan that the Rothschilds received, they were actually considered philanthropists for doing this, making money off our enslavement. You understand? Well, even physically owning slaves in the Bahamas, and that man made more money than all of them. You understand? And of course, the Rothschilds family is literally arguably the wealthiest family, even wealthier than the royal family themselves. You understand? Based mostly in these most nefarious ways that they did business. The British government did not finish paying back this loan to the Rothschilds family until late 2016. So see, the slavery thing isn't something that's so long ago. We need to forget about it and move on. Peace and love, everybody. And take care. Share the video. Like the page. Thank you.